The world has continued to watch shocking events unfold in Ukraine with Russia's incursion. And this has been going on for a while now, but we are over 2 years into really an outright war and endless attacks from Russia. What goes through your heart and your mind as you continue to watch this unfold?
Well, as a historian and a theologian or a person with theological background, there's kind of nothing new under the sun. There's sin, there's human failing, there's violence, and there are situations where that all has kind of a perfect storm. And we're living through a time when these hurricanes not only are happening naturally in Florida, but you have something going on in the Holy Land and in the Middle East. You have things going on in Africa, and you have the biggest war in Europe since World War II, which is an aggression by a degraded nuclear power with a second-class economy, but with extreme nostalgia for an imperial past.
Yeah, and looking at this, your history, I want to talk a little bit about your history because you are born in America, spent a lot of time in America, but then spent a great bulk of your life in Ukraine. You've been back in the U.S. now doing your ministry since 2019, I believe. And talking about your past, your parents were Ukrainian World War II refugees. So I would imagine, as a child, you heard quite a bit about what they went through, about the Soviet Union's treatment of them and other Ukrainians. Let's talk a little bit about that, and then we'll sort of flash forward into the current crisis.
Well, just in my family, they had a very hard life. My father was the 10th. My grandparents on his side buried 8 children. Those were before the war, actually, even. I mean, some as a result of World War I. My mother had 2 sisters, one of which died in the anti-Soviet resistance. Both were born in 1926, my parents. And my grandmother on the mother's side died as a refugee in 1944, before the war was over. They were refugees for 5 years in different places in Europe, in Austria and Germany, bombed out Germany. And then they came to the U.S. 1949 and 1950 with nothing. So the story of genocide, the story of the Ukrainian famine, in which 4 million people were starved to death on the most fertile land in the world, 1932-33, the horrors of the Soviets, the Nazis, the consequences of a world war, what it means to be a homeless refugee. My parents were 18 when they left home. My father left all alone. This was something that, we grew up with. And I knew that part of my family had been deported to Siberia. The 9th sibling in my father's family with his wife and children were deported to Siberia in the late 40s. And I knew we couldn't contact our relatives. I didn't have cousins, in the free world. So first cousins. And we couldn't contact them. It was an iron curtain. The iron curtain went through our family. My church in Ukraine, my Syracuse parish flourished, but my church was the biggest illegal church in the world, my church in Ukraine. So this was something, my first hunger strike for human rights was when I was 12 years old in 1973. We went on protest marches to Washington. So yes, this was very much part of my conscience. But I must say that, for example, last month when I went from Odessa through Kryvyi Rih, Zaporizhia, where the biggest nuclear power plant in Europe is located, the one occupied by the Russians and which has been, kind of damaged by the occupation. In Kharkiv, the city, Ukraine's second biggest city, which is hammered every day. I traveled there in September, and just speaking to the people, being at an agricultural cooperative, speaking with village mayors, intellectuals, university presidents, artists, writers, and always about the war. I came to understand my parents' experience much more granularly because
Yeah.
it's repeating. It's, with maybe in a different time, and some of the armaments are more sophisticated, but much of the war is happening in World War I style, actually. And I was sometimes only 20 miles away from the front, which is within artillery fire, not only missile and
Nice.
rocket fire.
And you've taken numerous trips since 2022. I know you've been there many times since
I've been
2022.
February 22. I've been there 11 times.
So, as we sort of talk through this, because one of the issues, and I know this working in media, when there's a story like this, A, it's very hard to keep the story in the media. And B, it's very hard for the people consuming the story to not be desensitized, meaning it's very hard for them to not fully understand what is going on because you're reading it. You almost forget that these are human beings, these are people in the midst of horrific circumstances. So, I want to address what are some of the things that you've seen, personally when it comes to the damage that has been done to people, to buildings. Just help us understand the gravity of what has been happening in Ukraine.
Okay. So in Ukraine, there's been about $1 trillion of infrastructure damage. In other words, it'll take $1 trillion to rebuild it. We can't even imagine what that
Wow.
really means. About 4,000 schools have been damaged or destroyed. Just think of your child, taking them to a school, your grandchild. Think of 4,000 of them. 1,700 hospitals and medical facilities. Just think of the cost of all that equipment. Think of bombs falling on the biggest children's hospital. This was in July of this year in Kyiv, as operations are happening. Think of maybe between bombs of air raid alerts and people that are hooked up to intravenous feeds have to be rushed downstairs because into the bomb shelters because you can't use the elevators at that time. Think about the fact that 15,000 miles of roads have been damaged, hundreds and hundreds of bridges, 630 churches.
Wow.
Most of them, by the way, are Orthodox churches destroyed by the Russian Orthodox inspired, imperialistic invasion. Because Patriarch Kirill is, explicitly calling this a holy war and promising heaven to the Russians that go in a jihadist way, promising heaven.
I want to pause there for a minute because you just described horrific damage. I can't even imagine the schools, the churches, the lives that have been impacted. You were starting to talk there about the role of faith in some of this because that has been very complicated. I think for Americans who don't understand, you were starting to get into what is being driven home here and that faith is maybe being, from your perspective, weaponized in a way to justify what Putin is doing. Take us through that because I think that's an important piece of this puzzle that has been left out of a lot of the media on this.
So, maybe by analogy, imagine if in, I don't know if we could imagine it, but Cuba is attacking Florida, and Fidel Castro's successors are saying Black people have to go back into slavery. I mean, this is a far-fetched thing. What will people of color in Florida do? The Russians basically are saying to Ukrainians, you have no identity. You are who we say you are, and you will do what we tell you to do. Your language is not a real language. You don't have a real history. You have no right for self-determination. Your churches, at best, lead people to hell, but really have no right for existence. Ukrainian Catholic Church is illegal where the Russians have occupied. And that has happened every time the Russians occupy since the 18th century.
Why? What is it about the Ukrainian Catholic Church that they take such issue with?
They don't believe in religious freedom. There is no religious freedom in Russia. Even Orthodox don't have freedom. Russian priests who they haven't necessarily protested against the war, they have refused to pray for a Russian victory in this war. They just, let's say, pray for peace. They have been persecuted and defrocked. The Russian Orthodox Church has about 400 bishops. Not a single one has stepped out against this war.
So can this is just, as you're saying this, you're a faith leader, right? And a prominent faith leader, and you're watching a lot of other faith leaders not step out. And I know this is complicated because of the dynamics within Russia, but what would your message be to those faith leaders and others who have not condemned what Russia and what Putin have been doing in this war?
Well, I would say which faith leaders haven't done it. The Catholic Church is, in its leadership, is very clear. I'm a member of the Catholic Bishops' Conference. There's 72 million Catholics, and in so many Catholic churches, there's prayer for a just peace in Ukraine, and not a single Catholic bishop in the U.S. has come out against aid to Ukraine, for example. The problems are among Protestants, particularly evangelicals, who, for example, some of them initially thought that Putin is a defender of traditional values, not realizing that the highest abortion rate in the world is in Russia, and Putin has been in power for 25 years. In Soviet times, the average fertile woman in Russia had approximately 7 abortions. Some had up to 20. There was no birth control. So, I'm not delving into Putin's private life, but most people had multiple abortions. And having control now, more than authoritarian control in a country, and claiming to protect traditional values, that is, it's so distant that people can have 180-degree opposite opinions about the reality. People just don't understand. Others believe that, well, it's far away. We have too many problems here we have to solve. But the inflation that we're all talking about during this election was very much affected by the Russian invasion. Our gas prices and food prices went up because of this Russian invasion. Ukraine feeds 400 million people, and with food, 10 times its population. When food from Ukraine, when the fields are bombed, when the ships through the Black Sea can't take grain out, global food prices go up. So what is happening in Ukraine, what Russia is doing, affects every single American. It affects your pocket. Every day you buy gas. That it's just so basic.
Well, you have a couple of issues coalescing here, because you brought up Protestants, evangelicals, and you have this other issue of politics, right? And you're referencing this now with the cost of everything, and the idea that America is in so much debt. The argument is we can't keep helping everyone else around the world. The other side of that argument, it's very easy to argue, we can't help people around the world. We need to help at home. But the reality is, many times the things, as you are saying, that are happening around the world actually impact the things that are happening at home. And then beyond that, and you can feel free to respond to this after, but I think it's important to say, there's this debate about the moral responsibility that the most powerful, wealthy nation in history has to the world, right? And people don't always love to talk about that, but that's a separate thing from the issues that affect people in America that are happening abroad as well. And just So I want to talk about some of that because I think the faith aspect coalesces with the political aspect, right? The belief of we need to take care of America from a government perspective, that kind of crosses into some of these other religious groups that you were mentioning, does it not?
Sure. Well, a lot of people are concerned about America getting involved in another quote unquote forever war. And Americans spent $7 trillion on war and reconstruction between Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan over a 20-year period. You could build a university in every major Ukrainian town and run it for 25 years for that money. But Ukraine is not Iraq. The Afghani government and army did not collapse against the Taliban. A little country is holding at bay, the biggest country in the world, which is being supported by China and financially by India, who they're buying Russian petroleum and gas and funding this war effort. So what will happen? Putin has occupied about 19% of Ukraine. That has displaced 14 million people. Never in the history of humanity have so many people been moved out of their homes within a 2-month period. Never in the time. Now, if he occupies another 20%, you'll have at least 10 more million people pouring into Europe, which will totally destabilize the European economy. 40% of our economy is connected with Europe. And it's going to jack up all the prices again in the United States. So the fact that we've spent less than, I think, 2% of our military budget supporting Ukraine, 2%, in Ukraine completely reduced basically to nothing the number of soldiers the Russians had at the beginning of this invasion. Now, there's been many more recruited, but Ukraine was supposed to collapse in 3 days. Nobody believed that Ukraine could stand. And with kind of a half-hearted help that really is geared for Ukraine not to lose, but it's not geared to make Russia lose. We have what we have. Ukrainians are still standing. Russia is the last European empire. The Ottoman Empire fell, the German Empire fell, the French, Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch, Danish, all had to let go of their colonies. Even the British Empire, that on which the sun never set, had to dissolve. Why and how did they dissolve? They dissolved ultimately when smaller countries fought for their dignity and the empire lost the war. France lost in Algeria. The Turks lost in World War, Turks and Germans lost in World War I, et cetera, et cetera. And nobody is going to go back to being a colony. The Ukrainians are saying liberty or death because occupation means death.
I have to ask two questions here because they're both important. And I want to go back. You were saying something a while ago about the Russian Orthodox Church. Talk a little bit more about that dynamic because, as Christians, the idea of using theology and the Bible to justify something unthinkable is horrific. But explain that dynamic a little bit more of how faith is being sort of used to tell people, no, this is okay. We should be doing this.
So in Russia, the religious practice is between 2 and 4%. On Easter, 4% of Russians go to church on Easter. And for example, in Moscow, it might be higher in one or other place. But people go in and light a candle. There is not, can we say that in any way the rituals that we see on camera that Putin does have a role in his life. He's probably the richest person in the world with everything that he owns and everything that he controls. He has much more control over real estate, buildings, money than Elon Musk or owners of Amazon or other major companies, Microsoft, and religion. We're sinners, and we Catholics are dealing with a shameful phase in history that we discovered. The sexual abuse. But now we're discovering it's in film, it's in sports, it's in medicine,
and the Baptists are dealing with it too, right? I mean, so it's not just the Catholics, right?
The Catholics, this cannot be proved, but the Catholic Church is one of the safest places in America right now because of all the rules and the awareness and the shame. That we have lived and still continue to live. We are a weak human race, and we're always on the edge of depravity. When, as Patriarch Kirill, talks about empire, and when he wants to control, Jesus went down. He gave up. He gave his life. The prototypical sin in the first pages of the book of Genesis is described as follows. God gives Adam everything and says, live the gift, live this gesture. And he says, don't take from this tree because it'll kill you. Don't do this, don't grab. And what does Adam do? Instead of living the gift, he lives the grab.
Yeah, isn't that what humans do? I mean, we do it constantly. We're always grabbing the thing that we shouldn't, right?
And we're self-referential. And when the church is saying, live the grab somebody's history, grab somebody's land, grab somebody's freedom, grab somebody's wheat, grab somebody's seacoast, grab somebody's dignity and identity, you have a situation. A fellow who ran the publishing for Patriarch Kirill, who left and is now a scholar at Fordham University, Sergei Chapnin, he told me in the presence of some ambassadors, until Russia falls on its knees, until the Russian Orthodox falls on its knees, and it basically is kind of crumbles, it will not reform. And that's true. Russia has to fall apart. This sounds radical, but Russia needs to lose, just like Nazi Germany had needed to lose, just like Imperial Japan needs to lose. They lost. They had to be on their knees, either spiritually or, let's say, socially and psychologically. And they had a chance, to revive. And look at Germany and Japan today. They're both, countries that many other countries envy, at least, economically. So these are hard things to understand. George Bush Sr. did not want the Soviet Union to fall apart. 3 weeks before the coup that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union, he was in Kyiv and warned the Ukrainians against the yearning for independence. George Bush Jr. looked Putin in the eyes. He said, I looked him in the eyes, saw his heart and saw he's an honest man. Barack Obama ridiculed Mitt Romney when Mitt Romney said Russia's our biggest threat. Now, in the book of Bob Woodward, that excerpts are emerging, it'll be published, I think, in a few days. It's revealed that Biden, in private conversation, said Barack Obama did not understand. And we missed it. We missed in 2014 the Russian occupation of parts of Ukraine, the annexation of Crimea. We should have responded forcefully then. But Biden's response has been much better than others would have done and say they will do. But it still is not decisive enough because people can't understand the depth of the depravity and danger that Putin represents.
So as we sort of round out to a close here, because you've been very generous with your time, you have a couple of different things, as we were talking about, happening in America. We have an election that is quickly approaching. There are people who are making the argument, as we stated, that America can't continue to fund these wars overseas. And then you have Christians who are trying to figure out, regardless of what denomination they're in, where they should stand. What is your message to America in a secular sense of how the government should handle this going forward, and to Christians in particular?
The Speaker of the House, Speaker Johnson, delayed for weeks putting forth a Ukraine aid supplemental bill. There were three things that convinced him, and this is what he said. I wanted to do the right thing. So Christians and others really think of the moral issues involved. Do the right thing. Second, he said, I had access to U.S. intelligence, global and military intelligence. I came to understand what's going on, which most people, don't know or don't follow because it is, accessible in the internet, all kinds of information. Listen to General Breedlove, for example. One name, look up his name and look at his videos. And third, a man from Odessa who I met 6 weeks ago, an evangelical, who was sleeping in another room of the house with his son, lost his wife and infant child that was killed by a Russian bomb in Odessa. And this man came to Washington and prayed with Johnson in his office, and they cried together. And Johnson saw how the evangelicals are being pummeled by the Russians, how evangelicals are being killed, how evangelical churches have been closed everywhere the Russians are. Not to mention, the Tatars, the Muslims in Crimea are incredibly persecuted. Jewish synagogues have been, destroyed. And the Ukrainian Catholic Church is illegal wherever the Russians are occupying. Also, the independent Ukrainian Orthodox Church is persecuted by the Russian occupiers wherever they're in control. So all religious faiths will be persecuted unless they, put the idol of Putin next to the Bible or next to the Quran or,
like what's happening in China. I mean, essentially in China, they are taking over the churches. They've been doing this for years. The same sort of thing happens. If Russia comes in and takes over all of Ukraine, just as we close out here, that puts your church, the Ukrainian Catholic Church, in, obviously, this is implicit in what you're saying, in severe danger, does it not?
We will be illegal. We will go again to the catacombs. We lived it in the 20th century. From 1946 to 1989, our church was the biggest illegal church in the world. I interviewed 2,000 people from that world, people who had sent to Siberia, who had parents or others executed. All our bishops were arrested. We lost every school, every church, every soup kitchen, every social, kind of ministry, all our publishing houses, our schools. And this is a living memory. There are people still alive in their 90s who saw this happen. And then there are people in their 60s who grew up in these circumstances. So people in Ukraine have no illusions what Russian occupation means because they remember it, they lived it. And now they're seeing these war crimes, these mass graves. They're seeing hospitals, apartment buildings, shopping centers. I was at a shopping center where a student from the university where I had the board of directors, she was killed. On September 1st, 7 weeks ago, I opened the academic year at the Ukrainian Catholic University, a fine small university, has the highest incoming SAT scores in Ukraine out of 200 universities. We had a prayer service, a Eucharist, opening the academic year. On September 4th, one of the students at the opening was killed by a bomb that killed her mother and both of her sisters. And the father buried his wife and all three children. I think it made, global news. You might, put up a picture of that family with this interview. That brings it home. It brought it home to Speaker Johnson, who went to Mar-a-Lago, and President Trump didn't oppose. He didn't come out against this supplement because Johnson went down and said, we have to do the right thing. Here's the military intelligence. And I'm telling you what the evangelicals are suffering under the Russians.
That is very interesting to hear those 3 points, and particularly that last one, because I think it goes back to what I was saying before. When people can't see themselves in a crisis or understand the human toll of it because they've been so inundated with numbers and stories, and it just becomes a thing that exists out there in the ether and not a very real thing, it becomes harder to connect. But when you bring those stories in and help people realize, what would you do if this were your wife, your husband, your mom, your dad, your aunt, your uncle? It changes everything. And I just appreciate you taking the time today to help us understand this. Would love to have you back again very soon. Appreciate it.
Yeah. So, people of faith, pray, because prayer moves mountains. And all people of goodwill, advocate. In other words, learn what is happening and explain it to others. And third, help as you can. There's great humanitarian needs. We have a humanitarian fund, but there's endless, incredible Americans that are helping. And I want to close with this, that Ukrainians, everywhere I went, and I traveled 500 miles along the front, and visited many other cities, the capital, other towns and places. People are grateful for American help. They're thanking you. And I want to thank you.
Well, I appreciate you. And yes, praying, helping, explaining to others and advocating, very important. Appreciate your time today.
God bless you.